Good morning, everyone. My name's Sarah Judd-Lamb. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research here at Carers New South Wales, and I recognise a number of the names on today. Before I get started, I just want to flag that we are recording the session today. So I think that should only just record the faces that are presenting. But if you're uncomfortable about that, feel free to switch your video off just in case. So we've got a couple still joining, and welcome to those that have just come through. We hopefully can see the slides that are up there. And so I can formally welcome you now to this session today, which is the third session in the Know Your Rights webinar series for carers. And the topic being, what can carers do about issues with disability services? So I'll be starting off the presenting today and then handing over to our guest speakers, Tammy Sokol from Legal Aid New South Wales and Laura Cottam from the Australian Centre for Disability Law. So welcome to our two guest speakers today. And my colleague Grace from the policy team here. So just to continue my introduction, so welcoming our guest speakers today, we'll speak to the session outline shortly, but before we get into the formal proceedings, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we are meeting on today. So for myself in North Sydney at the Carers New South Wales office, the traditional custodians are the Gorogal people of the Eora Nation. And I know we will have many other lands represented today from those of you joining us. So I extend my respects to the elders past, present and emerging in all of the lands that are represented today, and to all Aboriginal people. I mentioned, just as everyone was logging in, that we are recording the session today. This is so we can share it as a resource, and it will be available on our website. We will also send the link around to you when that is available via our YouTube account. So just please note that in terms of comments and videos perhaps being recorded. So if you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to turn your video off and just be aware that we will also be taking note of any comments that come through the chat. We will, as you will see in a moment, have some discussion time scheduled, plenty of discussion time later in the session following the first presentation. So if you do have questions that you have not answered through, you've not had answered through the pre-submitted questions from the registration form, as questions arise through the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat. And we will aim to get to those during the discussion session later on. So please do that, and we probably will have a chance then as well to allow people to put their microphones on to ask verbally questions if they would like. So just if we can go back to the Carers New South Wales slides, Grace, just before we head into that. So many of you will be familiar with Carers New South Wales, but just to very quickly note that we are the peak non-government organisation for family and friend carers in New South Wales. So we look at a range of sectors that carers engage with, including disability sector. If you can go to the next slide, please, Grace. And when we talk about carers, the term is used in a lot of different contexts, but we're talking about family members and friends that provide ongoing support to a person with a disability or another condition that requires care. And so it's an interesting angle on the topic of disability services and disability rights, talking about carers, but that's what our angle will be today. And we'll speak to that hopefully a little more later. And I guess while we leave it on that slide, it's just important to note, I think, you know, we acknowledge that not all people with disability identify as having a carer. Many people that are caring for a family member or friend with a disability would not call themselves carers. So we also acknowledge that population data does show that most people with disability report needing some sort of support with daily activities from a family member or friend. And so they're the group that we're speaking about, particularly the primary carers that may have a more involved hands-on role in providing care to a person with disability. But as you would be aware, disability services, you know, obviously primarily servicing the person with disability, as well as the families. So most of what we'll be talking about today is, I guess, rights and complaints that are available to consumers, to people with disability in their own right. But we're also trying to encourage family members and carers that are involved in the care to use those as well, to access those. So the session outlined today, so we'll be first hearing from our guest Tammy from Legal Aid New South Wales, because Legal Aid provides a couple of different forms of support. So Tammy will be talking about 2 forms of support that Legal Aid offer in this area around issues with the NDIS. And then we'll have some extended discussion time for questions from Tammy's presentation, for pre-submitted questions that have come in on the topic of disability rights and complaints via our registration form. And then towards the end, we're just going to hear briefly from Laura from the Australian Centre for Disability Law about a new project that they are offering around COVID-19 related discrimination in the disability context. We thought that would be relevant today, and it's not something that we've covered previously. And then I'll wrap up at the end. And I guess the most important thing to note in terms of the content from today is that we may not cover everything on this topic, but what we will be covering is what is included in a fact sheet on the same topic that we have developed with our Carer Rights and Complaints Network. So with the flyer and the registration form, hopefully you will have seen the link to those fact sheets. If you haven't, after Tammy's presentation, we'll give you a sneak peek of that, but we'll touch on some of those areas today in more detail. But questions that you have that are not met today, hopefully will be answered in those fact sheets. And there's a contact email address as well on those fact sheets if you have any follow-up questions after today. So I think that is everything by way of introducing the session. And that means we can introduce our first speaker. So if we go to the next slide, I'm pleased to introduce Tammy from Legal Aid New South Wales, who's going to speak to us for about 15 minutes on a couple of different things from Legal Aid's perspective that relate to this area of carers' rights and complaints options within the context of disability services. And once again, if you've got any questions for Tammy as she's speaking, feel free to put those in the chat. And if she's not able to cover those in her presentation, we will have plenty of time to address them later on. So thank you, Tammy, over to you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. First, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm broadcasting to you today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So today, as you know, we're discussing rights of review, I guess, for NDIS. And to give you a bit of background first, I wanted to talk to you about and getting to know a little bit about what Legal Aid is and understanding what sort of services we provide. So you can see in the map attached with the PowerPoint, Legal Aid has 24 offices around New South Wales, and we provide advice and representation services to people across New South Wales in those 24 offices and also in about 200 different outreach locations. Those services are in 3 different areas, from criminal, family law, and where I'm from today, I'm from the Civil Law Division of Legal Aid. Now, how can we help you? As I said, there are different advice and different representation services that Legal Aid provides. We do offer, in most circumstances, we will provide a free 30-minute confidential legal advice appointment about all civil law issues. And that is regardless of means. And then depending on the circumstances of a particular legal issue, we have certain guidelines and means test eligibility to be able to provide further representation services on behalf of those clients as well. Importantly, I guess, in our Civil Law Division, for the purposes of today, we have specialist civil law teams that are based in our Sydney head office. We have one which is an NDIS specific government law team, which they do reviews, and I'll talk a little bit more about what they do, but they are looking at reviews of NDIA decisions in the AAT, which is the Administrative Tribunal, as well as having the consumer law team, of which I'm a part. And our consumer law team assists people with consumer complaints where their goods or services are not provided with due care or skill, or where there are problems with services that are provided. In this case, we're talking about disability services that might be provided under an NDIS service agreement. So the really important takeaway from today, and what I want to emphasize to all of you, is that it's really important to get advice as soon as possible. So some of the case studies I'm going to talk about later, some of the challenges that we've had is that people come to us when matters are in crisis, which can make it really difficult to get, you know, an outcome that we want. So we do want to encourage you, as soon as you see some instance of something that you're unhappy with, to try and seek advice as early as possible, so that you have the most amount of time to be able to, you know, resolve whatever the dispute is. Okay, so the next thing I guess I wanted to talk about, so looking at reviews of NDIA decisions. So the next slide, please, Grace. So there are two different levels of review. The first review is an internal review by the NDIA themselves, and the second is an external review, and that's the Administrative Appeals Tribunal that I mentioned earlier. So at those, there are different time limits for each of those types of review, and you need to go through each step. You need to go through step 1 before you can access step 2. You can make a review to, you can request an internal review by the NDIA, either in writing or by making an oral request, or through the NDIA website, there is a form that you can complete, a review request form. And the NDIA review must be provided with reasons in writing. So that's really important, and that's guaranteed under the NDIS Act itself. Now, the time limit for putting in an internal review, Grace, if you move to the next slide, is that you have 3 months from that original decision to request a review of that decision. And that's a fairly strict time limit. There is no opportunity for an extension available. And so again, really important that as soon as you receive a decision, you or the person that you're caring for, that you try to be mindful of these time limits and you act quickly. It's also worthwhile making sure, especially if you're going to be requesting a review orally, that the NDIA are really clear that you have made a formal request for review. So that's a really important step as well. The next slide, please, Grace. So I've just put some examples here of what are the types of decisions that you can seek a review about. A person may not meet certain access criteria, a refusal to refund certain supports, a refusal to review a person's plan, decisions about nominees, and decisions about compensation. So the next stage, if you're unhappy with the NDIA's internal review of one of those decisions, the next step is to seek advice about going to the AAT. The AAT is an independent body, and it's a federal administrative review tribunal. So that means that they're looking at the decision in the shoes of the decision maker. Those applications to the AAT must be made in writing. And so you can fill out an application form on their website. You can write a letter or send an email as well. And applications to the tribunal about NDIS matters are free. So that's really important. As far as time limits of going to the AAT, it's a stricter time limit than the 3 months that we saw earlier. So you have, just the next slide, Grace, you have 28 days to appeal, to put in your application to the AAT to review the earlier decision of the NDIA. In certain limited circumstances, you can get an extension, unlike the earlier review process. But again, the earlier you act, the better. Before I move on to the next slide, I guess just to summarize, that review process is really about decisions of the NDIA themselves relating to a participant's plan or those matters that I raised earlier. That is the specialist team that would be providing advice for those types of disputes is our NDIS government law team. And they, especially at our head office in Sydney, if you are interested in getting advice about that type of review, we would recommend just calling, and I've got the details coming up later, calling into Legal Aid and requesting an appointment. As I said, everyone is entitled to a 30-minute appointment, free of charge, which you can talk through some of the steps that people, that you might be able to assist someone with that you're caring for. Really, I guess from a just administrative point of view, usually it's the person with a disability that will be formally our client, but we're very accustomed to working with carers to be able to make sure the best outcome for the NDIS participant. And so depending on the capabilities of the participant themselves, we'll work together with you and the participant to be able to give advice about what the next steps are in your particular matter, but also to be able to work with you if we're going to be doing ongoing representation work as well. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So the next matter is about consumer law complaints. So what I've got here, I've got three different logos because as you may be aware with the transition over to the NDIS, it's very different arrangement about where, how you complain about a service provider. So in the past, if you're receiving disability support through the New South Wales government or ADAC, then you would be complaining to the New South Wales Ombudsman. Now, where you continue to receive New South Wales funded disability supports, you can still go to the New South Wales Ombudsman. But most people who are receiving services through an NDIS service agreement, it's now a market-based approach. So it's a relationship that's between the consumer and between the service provider. And so what that means is it's quite a different approach to what we've had in the past and opens up new avenues of review if you're unhappy with the services that you're provided with. If you are unhappy with the service of the NDIA specifically as a government agency, for those complaints against the actions of the NDIA, they should be directed to the Commonwealth Ombudsman. But for predominantly most of the complaints that you might find in terms of the provision of the goods or services, those complaints are now going to a newly established body, which you may be aware of, called the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, or NQSC. So that body is set up to really mediate disputes between service providers and NDIS participants where they feel that the goods or services are not provided appropriately. And that's your main avenue of complaint. If you are still unhappy with the goods and services and you're unable to resolve it with the Quality and Safeguards Commission, then you do have rights of review at the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal under the Australian consumer law. I just want to acknowledge, I guess, about taking matters to a tribunal versus going to the Quality and Safeguards Commission. A lot of people, in our experience at least, a lot of people have long-standing relationships with their service providers and sometimes feel hesitant to make complaints because they're worried about, some sort of retaliation, or they're worried that it will destroy the relationship that they have with the service providers. And this is a really valid issue. And also why usually we would recommend to go to the Quality and Safeguards Commission as a first step, because it is more mediation. It is there really to resolve the dispute and try and protect the relationship. In some cases, going to a tribunal seems fairly adversarial and may be difficult. It really is on a case-by-case basis that you'll have to look at those issues in your case or in the case of someone that you're caring for, and work out what is the best place to go to try and get the outcome that you're seeking. just to reiterate, the best first step in all of these, if you are seeking specific advice on your particular situation, is to book an appointment, a 30-minute appointment, to come and see a legal aid lawyer and to talk through the issues that you're facing. And they will be able to guide you between all of these many different areas and avenues of review, what's the most suitable for you. Just moving on to a case study I thought would be useful. There are a couple of case studies I wanted to talk about, just to give you an example of what sort of assistance we've been able to provide in, this is in consumer matters. And then we'll look at a couple of other supports that legal aid might be able to assist you with. So one example is a client who came, a carer actually, who came, a mother who came to us where their son, who was had an accommodation arrangement under an NDIS service agreement, they were threatening eviction, imminent eviction. And as I sort of hinted at earlier, it came at a big crisis point, and we were fairly concerned that this person was going to not have anywhere to live if they were evicted from this accommodation. We were able to assist in negotiating directly with the service provider to try and get an extension of time for, while the mother was organising alternative accommodation arrangements, and we were able to do that by way of negotiation. So in that case, our intervention was sort of more direct. We didn't utilise any of the formal avenues of review, but we were able to support the carer to be able to get that extension of time that they needed to ensure that her son wasn't left out on the street. So that was a really good outcome, and in a very volatile situation. Another example which I wanted to give was about where the care services fell short of what the expectations were. We had a client who was in an accommodation, supported accommodation, and the assertion was by the NDIS participant was that there was substandard and negligent services, and even in this case, unfortunately, an assault by a staff member on the NDIS participant, which was reported to police. The client had subsequently left that accommodation, but the accommodation provider was seeking repayment of unpaid fees in the order of about $4,000. Through our intervention, again, negotiating directly with the accommodation supporter, the accommodation service provider, we were able to have those fees waived on account of the failure to provide a suitable service, as well as some other particular vulnerabilities relating to that client. So those are two really good outcomes for those clients where they were facing challenges with their service providers. Now, the last thing, I guess, in terms of what support we can provide in the other types of matters, so the earlier types of matters. I've talked so far about the advice services that we can provide, and in those case examples, we call that minor assistance. So where it's up to 3 hours of assistance that we can provide free of charge. We also are able to provide representation services in AAT matters where the matter is complex or novel, and also the client, in this case the NDIS participant, has to meet certain vulnerability and means tests to be able to access that representation at the AAT level. Prior to that, so if you're doing an internal review, legal aid is limited to that 30-minute advice session. And again, with the consumer law matters, it would start out with a 30-minute advice, and then if further assistance is required, it would depend on means and merit as well. For both of those, you wouldn't have, if you fell under the correct eligibility requirements, there would be no fees associated that you'd have to pay legal aid for that assistance. Okay, so that's a very brief summary of what legal aid support is available if you do find yourself wanting to review either a decision of the NDIA, or if you're unhappy with the services that you or the person you care for has received under an NDIS service agreement. I've included there just our contact details, and once you call through and explain the circumstances and where you are, you'll be triaged and given an appointment at a location close to where you are.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tammy, for that presentation, and for those that are familiar with the fact sheet that corresponds with this today's webinar, as I linked in the chat, Tammy's covered a lot of the ground that is covered in the fact sheet. There's a lot of different players, there's a lot of different pathways. We understand it can be complicated, so we're here to answer your questions about that, but also hopefully some of those questions are clarified in the fact sheet, which also has our contact details on it if you have things that come up later. So I think before we get into the pre-submitted questions, perhaps we can start with the two questions that we had come through on the chat to see whether you're able to respond to those, Tammy. So thanks, Joan and Eileen. Joan's question was, what is the average time frame for the NDIA to respond to the review request?
That's a good question. Because as I said earlier, I'm from the consumer law team, not from the government law team. I can take that on notice and get back to you about the time frame. I mean, my experience generally is that there isn't a specific time frame in which they're required to respond. But I will take that on notice, and I'll see if I can get you further information.
Thanks for that, Tammy. Second question there, does a carer need to be an official NDIS nominee? I assume in relation to working with legal aid, if that's the correct question?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so you don't need to be an official NDIS nominee to assist someone, to assist an NDIS participant, come to legal aid and get some support and advice. Obviously, depending, as I said earlier, on the capacity of the participant themselves or the person you're caring for, there'll be different level of engagement and support. But no, you don't. You're not required to be an official nominee to get assistance.
Thanks for that, Tammy. We do, as I said before, have some questions that were pre-submitted in the registration process that both Tammy and myself are going to address. But before we do that, did anyone that is online and hasn't popped it in the chat, does anyone have any clarification questions for Tammy based on her presentation before we have a broader discussion? Well, we'll move to the pre-submitted questions then. So thank you for those that did put detailed questions in with their registration. So there's a few here. I might, Tammy, go to the ones that you said you were comfortable to address first. So one question that came through was, how do I complain about a disability provider without risking repercussions for my child? If I complain about specific events, the provider will know who it is about. So I know you've already touched on this. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, I don't think there's no simple answer because you can't really make complaints anonymously, because then they can't be investigated and looked into and conciliated between the parties. It is a problem that we recognise and that we've been faced with, especially, and I know this will come up in one of the other questions, in rural and remote areas where there are few service providers. It is really difficult for that market approach to really work effectively where there just are not that many providers to choose from. The only thing I would encourage in this situation is to, as I said earlier, to try and choose dispute resolution methods that try and preserve the relationship as much as possible. And I think sometimes working with a legal advocate or someone with a bit of arm's length can sometimes help to do that. There are also in New South Wales free general mediation available through the Community Justice Centre mediation. So that's an alternative. It's not a disability specific complaints mechanism, but it's a free mediation service that again just brings both parties together with an independent mediator to try and see if you can resolve the issues whilst obviously maintaining the relationships as well.
Great, thanks Tammy. And the other question I think you've kind of covered in that, which was around the difficulties of regional and rural areas and I guess limited service provider options. So I think we'll take that as covered.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one additional thing about that. I mean, it is a challenge, and I mean the experience that we've had and the clients that we've seen, the challenges come when the expectations haven't really been set up at the beginning often. So if you are entering into new service agreements, you know, they may be service providers that aren't familiar with the, you know, they're really, even though it's only been a couple of years already, and not familiar with, you know, the fact that the service agreement is a contract. And that means that it should be fairly detailed. It should set out both parties' rights and make it really clear from the outset about what the expectations are. And so I think that sometimes, you know, the matters come to us when they're already in dispute, but the opportunity is there when you're setting up new arrangements on behalf of the person you care for or you're being involved, to make sure that those service agreements set out and that you anticipate what if something goes wrong, especially if there are only a few options in town. And you try and avoid those problems down the track by setting those expectations clearly from the beginning.
That's great advice. That was kind of how I was going to segue that into the next question, because I think some questions that came through were more around how you set up those relationships in the first place, which doesn't really speak specifically to complaints, but obviously is important grounding to prevent complaints in the end. Yep. So another question that we received was, how can I access information about service options outside of marketing or vested interests to make an informed decision? And this is an ongoing challenge, I think, in these market-driven service systems for care provision. And I guess, you know, we are not experts in that, but I would point you towards looking initially at the NDIS website, which does have some high-level advice around where you can get assistance with finding registered providers, which is what is required for people that are going NDIS managed. So we can send that link around to that page, and it refers to sort of the local area coordinator's role, the plan manager and support coordinator's role, and it also links to the registered provided list for New South Wales. Obviously, for those that are self-managed or plan managed, there's a bit more flexibility, and there are a number of registered provider, not registered providers, there are a number of NDIS provider search functions and online directories available, as well as online platforms for workers. And I don't think we're in a position to recommend one or another, but what I would encourage people to do is, in the first instance, look at the information on the NDIS website. We'll send that link around with the follow-up email from today. It's got some questions there around how to kind of scope out a provider and see whether they're appropriate. So it's got some guidance around that. And then also, if you are just going to look up on Google or a search engine around NDIS service provider directories and options, and there are a number of different things available to look up those options. So that would be how I answer that question, unless you had anything to say on that, Tammy?
No, nothing additional from us.
And the other thing is that there's information on the NDIS website about service agreements as well. And so in understanding what to look for in a service provider, what to set up with them initially, that's really helpful for just making sure that things go as planned. Another question that we had that came through was, is psoriasis a disability? It's an autoimmune disease that is not recognised by the NDIS, and talking about eligibility. And so I guess just to kind of flag, and again, it's not really a complaints rights issue until it's about kind of access decisions and disputing the access decisions, which we touched on earlier. But something important to point out, I think, is that the definition of disability, for example, in the New South Wales Disability Inclusion Act, is one thing. The definition of a significant permanent disability in the NDIS eligibility criteria is another thing again. And it's definitely true that a lot of people have trouble with the eligibility criteria and may not meet it, may feel that they'll fall outside of it, may disagree with the decision about eligibility. So for that situation, I would point you to the fact sheet, which specifically deals with how to dispute an access decision. But also in I guess our broader role as a peak body, we really encourage anyone that's having trouble. So I guess there's a group of people that are not eligible for NDIS, and just flatly not eligible. So even if they were to appeal it, they just fall outside the eligibility criteria, but they still need support. And this is something that is a challenge in New South Wales, that Carers New South Wales continues to advocate for. So if people are in that situation and there is no support that they can access to meet their needs, the first thing I would suggest would be contacting Carer Gateway to see what other types of support might be available. And we can provide that information in the email that we send you. And also, you're welcome to contact the policy team at Carers New South Wales to flag particular issues around services, because these gaps are something that we advocate about more broadly. So we will send that information around. I've just noticed we have had a couple more comments here. So maybe we'll address the one that's come through in the chat in between the others. So we've had one come through which says, to register for the NDIS is very expensive. Who pays for the specialists? And I would like to know if there is funding for specialists to assist with funding. Tammy, did you want to say anything about that, or should I respond to that?
The only thing I'll say as far as legal aid funding goes is that up until the point where you're in the AAT, there is no funding available for specialist reports or otherwise. If you do fulfill the criteria, the eligibility criteria that I mentioned earlier about the issue being complex and novel, and meeting the vulnerability and means tests, then you do have up to $2,000, I think it is, under the grant of legal aid to use for specialist reports. But up until that point, unfortunately, no legal aid funding is available for those reports.
Thanks for clarifying that. And I think, yeah, look, the specialist payments has been an ongoing issue as well. And obviously many of you will be aware of the current conversations around the independent assessment changes to the NDIS. So I think in addition to Tammy's advice, I wouldn't say I have anything specific to add, but it's, I think, just something to keep an eye out for as things change a bit, and to discuss with your local area coordinator if you have concerns or questions, or to ask the NDIA by phoning the 1-800 number. We also had someone comment that there is a good resource on the DSC resource website around service agreements. So we're happy to have a look at that and maybe share that in response to the last question. We've also had another comment around the NDIA planning for the NDIS independent assessments with no appeal. So yeah, the independent assessments area, which is sort of the broader policy area, and it's still being looked at by the Joint Standing Committee into the NDIS at the moment, but there were some consultations around that. And so as to the question, what can we do about the NDI plan, there'll be no appeal. I think it's difficult to comment as yet while those things are still in flux, but there's definitely been, so I'm sure a number of us have been involved in providing feedback to the NDIA via the consultation paper about the independent assessments last month and month before last. And many of us may have also provided input to the Joint Standing Committee that's looking into the independent assessments. You know, I'll be open in saying there's been a number of concerns around that process, around the policies. The appeal thing is one of the things we've advocated about. So I don't know that there's 100% clarity on that yet, but I think if you're concerned about it, I would encourage you to speak to peak organisations like ourselves, you know, liaise with opportunities like the Joint Standing Committee, the Disability Royal Commission around this issue, and just make it clear that that appeals area is really important to get right. Yeah, I guess that's all I would say on that, and that we will definitely, once that is more settled, we'll incorporate any new information about that into this series of fact sheets to make sure that that's accurate. Was there anything you wanted to say about independent assessments, Tammy?
No, nothing further to say. Yeah.
No problem. So we've had one of the other pre-submitted questions we had was about mainstream services in New South Wales and what can be done to make them more inclusive for people with disability, children with disability and carers. So that's a great question. And I guess Again, it's kind of a bit different in terms of the complaints context, but one thing that so with the fact sheet that I'll actually show you in a minute, one of the things that did not get included in that fact sheet in any depth was discrimination legislation. However, we work closely with the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, and with the Human Rights Commission, both of whom are on the working group that has developed these fact sheets and webinars. And we're in the process of developing some more in-depth resources around disability discrimination and carer discrimination, which does touch on inclusion in sort of community and public settings. So I guess for that purpose, I would really encourage people to contact Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, and we can include their contact details in the follow-up email, because they're able to just provide advice on whether a particular situation constitutes an actual discrimination issue, and they can tell you whether that can be taken further, or if that's covered in the New South Wales legislation. They're really responsive community engagement team, so I'd encourage people to discuss with them any particular instances around barriers to inclusion in community and service settings. But in a broader context, there's quite a lot of obligations and sort of expectations of services around two pieces of legislation in New South Wales. There's the New South Wales Disability Inclusion Act 2014, and there's the New South Wales Carers Recognition Act. And so again, I'd encourage people to look at those pieces of legislation and to use those when having conversations with services. So in any of this kind of complaints and appeals information, we would always encourage people to first raise an issue with the service provider and give them the opportunity to respond. And sometimes people are not aware that there's expectations around making services inclusive. Sometimes they just need a friendly reminder of that. And those pieces of legislation are helpful tools in basically just reiterating to providers what their requirements are, that there is an expectation that services be inclusive to people with disability and carers. And while there's not necessarily always a very concrete complaints pathway available to support those principles, it is something where disability advocacy organisations and also peak organisations like ourselves, we can have some influence and impact around raising these issues. So once again, if it's not a discrimination issue, if it's a broad observation or a challenge in a particular environment, you're welcome to raise that with our policy team by the contact details we'll provide, and we can use that as a case study in our ongoing relationships with different government agencies and advocate for that in the policy setting. Anything else you wanted to add, Tammy?
Just that you were mentioning resources, so I thought it's probably timely also to just, I didn't really touch on what other resources Legal Aid has available. We have a publication available on our website that's currently being reviewed, but it's largely going to be the same as what's already up there, about your rights of review for decisions of the NDIA. So that's available on our website. And I also wanted to make a mention that the NQSC, the Quality and Safeguards Commission, have a lot of really good resources available in other languages and also in easy English to be able to explain the complaints process and where the best place is to complain. So I think there, between Carers New South Wales, Legal Aid, the complaint bodies themselves, there are a lot of resources available to be able to help you navigate these fairly tricky complaint avenues.
Definitely. And another question's come through, another couple actually. Can Legal Aid, this one for you, Tammy, can Legal Aid and the other appeal processes assist young carers under the age of 18?
Legal Aid definitely can, depending on the capacity, as I said earlier, depending on the capacity of the NDIS participant themselves. It might be that it's the participant that is the client, is the one that's sort of advocating with the assistance of the carer. So that shouldn't be any barrier that the carer is below the age of 18.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. The other question that's come through is following on from the earlier question around autoimmune diseases and whether there's any information about that. I'm not aware of specific fact sheets around autoimmune diseases in relation to the NDIS, there's probably something out there. But I think that, again, the best source of information on if it's around NDIS eligibility and support is the NDIS website. There's information on there around conditions that are covered and how they describe eligibility. So I think that's the best point of call, because at the end of the day, if it's around NDIS eligibility, that comes down to their decision, and then it's about appealing that decision if you disagree with that on the basis of what they're meant to cover, and legal aid and other supports can help you work out whether it should fall within the eligibility criteria. So I think that's the best place to look, or to phone the NDIA as well to ask if there's any information on those particular conditions. The other thing to try would be a peak body. So there's lots of condition-specific organisations or disability-specific organisations. It's maybe worth having a look whether there are particular organisations that advocate around autoimmune diseases. I know organisations like Rare Diseases Australia, there might be some other peaks like that would have developed some resources. That's worth checking. We have gotten to the end of our pre-submitted questions, unless there's any others that have come through the chat. What I guess I wanted to show you before we've got a couple of minutes before we're going to move on to Laura. So thanks very much, Tammy, for being very helpful in that presentation and Q&A as well. It's been really, really helpful. And so what Grace has got up there now is the fact sheet that relates to today's session. So just to really point you to that, and as I said, everything we've touched on today should be covered in some form under that fact sheet, and there's some additional content there as well. And so just to highlight to you what topics are covered, as you can see, if I just have a look at it myself, there's a little bit around the NDIS access and the different points at which there might be some conflict to resolve. There's also information about quality and safety of services. There's a case study there. We address the consumer rights issues around purchasing services and products that are come under consumer law, and we also mention where you can get some support and the Ageing and Disability Commissioner. So the other element that we haven't gone into depth about today is the Ageing and Disability Commissioner around any concerns around abuse and neglect. And so again, just to really flag that any situations that come up around rights and complaints in the context of community abuse and neglect, or even institutional abuse and neglect, the Ageing and Disability Commission is a really important contact, and they can forward your concern or question on to the right organisation. So I have provided the link to those fact sheets in the chat, and we will again include that in the email following the session. But I just wanted to draw your attention to that. And we, I think, are ready to hand over to Laura. And we've invited Laura today to speak briefly just about a new initiative that's more specifically related to COVID. So when we put this fact sheet together, it was before COVID. It launched last year, but it was before COVID, and we wanted to make sure that the information was, I guess, longer term. So we haven't included COVID specific information in that fact sheet, but we've been discussing with the Australian Centre for Disability Law recently around some activities that they are running to support people in that context. And so Laura's just going to provide some new information on that so that you can follow up with that if that's relevant to you. And then we'll come back to me to wrap up. So thank you, Laura.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. So look, I apologise, normally it would be my colleague Antoinette Natoli who's actually running this particular COVID project, but she's very unwell today and has lost her voice, so she's asked me to fill in. So she'll be the contact for this particular project. So I'll just give you background on the Australians, for those who aren't familiar, the Australian Centre for Disability Law. We're a specialist community legal centre based in New South Wales. We're based in Surrey Hills, near Central, but we service the entirety of New South Wales. We provide legal advice and representation and assistance to people with disability across New South Wales. In terms of the context, for carers, we can speak to carers on people's behalf. We can speak to carers and people with disability together. We do welcome any kind of contact by people who with a disability and people assisting people with a disability. and we do actually have a lot of contact with carers in particular, and are always keen to have more of that. We provide definitely one-off advices in a lot of different areas, mainly disability discrimination, but we do other areas of law as well, other sort of civil areas of law. And we do provide limited representation and further assistance in disability discrimination complaints in particular, through Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, the Australian Human Rights Commission, and further on to the courts and the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. We also do some policy work, and we do a fair bit of community legal education, generally on disability discrimination matters. So in late last year, we were funded by money from the government to provide additional assistance. So it's a new project that we've got, a COVID-19 project, to provide free legal assistance to people with disability and their associates, and that includes carers or people who've been discriminated against in some way, who've experienced legal problems due to COVID-19 restrictions. It's not limited just to disability discrimination, so it's a broader context. We applied for this funding and were successful because we realised that obviously during COVID-19, people's access to their regular services, people's access to things like employment, services and buildings, accessing normal things that they would normally be able to access was obviously limited, and that they might not even be aware that there's an option for a complaint or there's something else they could do. And it's something that perhaps could, needs to be changed. Obviously, the COVID-19 situation is constantly evolving. And so, it's really important that cases get made and complaints get taken, so that way services that have been limited or, changed in some way because of the pandemic and continue to do so, realise that they still can't infringe upon the rights of people with disability. That's the thing that we've been very conscious of. There might have been interaction with police, there might be additional sort of domestic or family violence issues, additional fines, consumer complaints. So what we're really looking for, part of the project's sort of got a few different aspects to it. We want to provide legal education to community-related organisations about these issues, so that they can help identify people who might be having these problems and refer them to us for legal advice and assistance. We know a real emphasis on hard to reach communities in both residential and institutional settings and students. It's a free legal service. So what we're looking to do is identify the communities in need, provide the basic legal education, and then have referrals to the Centre for any legal work as required, because we'll take on sort of legal advices and representation in these kind of areas. So keen to connect with people in this service so that we can talk about how we can best work together to get information about the service out, and also get access to the client base so that we can help the most people. While I'm here, I'll also briefly touch on two other projects that we're doing. We both of them are through what was formerly the NDIA, but now through the Department of Social Services, their ILC projects. One of them is about students with disability in education. We've created a toolkit called Learning Together. It's available on our website. It provides advocacy tips and assistance for students in education with disability in education and their families and carers about how to get the best access to the adjustments that you need when you're in an education setting, and how to advocate for those effectively, and if it doesn't work, how to get some legal support with those situations. So I encourage people to have a look at that on our website. And there's also an additional project that we're running together with People with Disability Australia and the First Peoples Disability Network about access for First Peoples to their legal rights and self-advocacy. So that's an outreach project. It's obviously been hampered somewhat by COVID, but we're focusing on that project about getting access to First Nations communities and assisting them to get more information about their rights and self-advocate. So that project's well underway now. So yes, a lot of information, but if you have any interest in or want to know more about any of these services, I'll be providing the information about the contact people for these services to the lovely Grace and Sarah, who will provide that to you. So, but that's, for general legal advice assistance, or to chat to someone about whether you've got a case or whether there's something else you can find out about, please feel free to give the centre a call. We're really happy to talk to carers and to talk to people with disability on a variety of issues. And if we're not the right place, we'll refer to someone who can.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Laura, for joining us. And it's great to hear that there's some additional initiatives happening in this area. And so I guess in wrapping up, taking a deep breath after all that content, often at this point in these webinars, a lot of information has been provided. And I think something that's very clear in all of these fact sheets, but particularly in the disability area, there is no shortage of people you can call, resources you can look at about issues. what the complexity is who to go with what issue, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So just to bring it back to, I guess, the purpose of this series of webinars and the series of fact sheets is Carers New South Wales understands how complex that can be for carers. And so the fact sheet that we showed you earlier, we went to great lengths working with the relevant complaints agency to get that information in as brief and simple form as possible. It can always be further simplified, but if your head's spinning a little bit and you're not sure still where your particular issue or complaint should go, the first thing is look at that fact sheet, see if it answers your question. We've really tried to reduce it to the key pathways, the key areas of concern. And if your question's not covered or it needs to, additional information is needed on the fact sheet, let us know. Our contact emails on that fact sheet. But the second thing would be to flag that these fact sheets were developed by a network of complaints agencies and peak bodies led by Carers New South Wales and the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice that has been working on this topic for several years now. And so one thing that's been very encouraging, especially in the disability space, is that the various organisations that we work with, including those here today, including those mentioned on the fact sheet, are really aware of how challenging it can be to navigate all these options. And so what I think most, if not all of those organisations would say to carers with an issue is contact someone, your best guess based on the fact sheet information. And in most cases, the person that you contact will be able to pass you on to the right person if that's not them. And what's really been great about working with these complaints agency has been, I know carers often have the experience, or they tell us that they have the experience where they phone one person for help and then they give it another phone number, and then they phone that phone number for help and then they give it a number, and then they just end up being passed around between numbers and it takes hours of their time. So while it may not always be everyone's experience, but certainly a lot of the organisations working in this space have a commitment to warm referring people. So basically, rather than saying here's a number, call it, to taking responsibility for forwarding that person to the right organisation or the right person within their team. So it's really worth a try at figuring out who you think is the right person to contact based on the fact sheet, which hopefully lays it out as simply as possible. And then from there, it's reasonable to expect that that person will help you find the right place. And there's, I mentioned some of the organisations that are particularly committed to that. Legal Aid New South Wales is one of them. I know Fair Trading is very good at doing that. I know also, as I mentioned before, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. These are all key partners in this project who will help people find the right source. And so really, in wrapping up, our purpose in putting on these webinars is to encourage carers and the people that work with carers to raise issues as they arise. Even though it can be time consuming, it can be disappointing, there's lots of options available for getting issues resolved. And if there's issues in these systems, let us know. But in many cases, they enable carers to get better outcomes and the people they care for to get issues resolved. So I have included the link to those fact sheets again in the chat. We'll send you an update email in an hour or two with the relevant links. I also want to draw your attention to the evaluation form link that will be sent around. It's just a brief few questions, just getting your feedback on today's session. If you are interested in more of these sessions, we're running them monthly on different topics, and the next one will be in mid-May on the topic of health services. So through the same link, you'll be able to find information on upcoming sessions, and feel free to register for as many as you like. They're all free. And once again, feel free to contact our policy team with any questions or suggestions. So just to another last thank you to our guest speakers today, Tammy and Laura. Thank you very much for joining us and providing some really great content. And we hopefully will see some of you again at future sessions.